3 years ago, I thought I would die as a Muslim. Today, I am a living testimony of God's miraculous grace. My name is Adam Hamza. I was born in Mosul, Iraq, into a devout Sunni family. My father served as an imam at our local mosque. My mother taught Quranic studies to young girls in our neighborhood. I memorized the entire Quran by age 12. I led prayers for my university classmates. I fasted during Ramadan with unwavering dedication. I performed my pilgrimage to Mecca when I turned 21, believing I was walking in the footsteps of the Prophet himself. For 26 years of my life, Islam was not just my religion. It was my identity, my purpose, my entire understanding of existence. I would have died defending it. In fact, I almost did die because of it. How does a man who spent his life studying Islamic theology, who taught children to recite verses in Arabic, who called Christians people of the book but believed their scriptures were corrupted, how does such a man come to call Jesus Christ his Lord and Savior? The answer lies in a journey through hell itself. A journey that began on an ordinary Tuesday morning in June 2022, when I kissed my mother goodbye and told her I would return home for dinner. I had no way of knowing that those would be the last words I would ever speak to her as her Muslim son. What happened to me in the months that followed challenges everything you think you know about faith, about conversion, about the power of God to reach into the darkest places on earth. This is the account of how Jesus Christ himself appeared to me in an ISIS prison cell, while my captors were deciding whether to execute me or sell me as a slave. This is how the God I had rejected my entire life chose to reveal his love through the very people I had been taught to consider infidels. What you are about to hear will disturb you. It will challenge comfortable assumptions about religious conversion. It will force you to confront the reality of evil that still exists in our world today. But more than anything else, it will demonstrate that no person is beyond the reach of God's redemptive power. The family that raised me has disowned me. The community that once honored me now considers me dead. Former friends have threatened my life. I have lost everything that once defined who I was. And yet, I have never been more alive. I have never known such peace. I have never experienced such overwhelming love. Because in losing my old life, I discovered life eternal. My story begins in the ancient city of Mosul, in northern Iraq, where the Tigris River has flowed for thousands of years, and where my family had lived for 7 generations. I was born Adam Hamza on March 15, 1996, the eldest son of Imam Rashid Hamza, who served at the Al-Nouri Mosque, the same mosque where the great minaret had stood for over 800 years. My father was not just any imam, he was considered one of the most learned Islamic scholars in our district, a man who had spent 15 years studying Islamic jurisprudence in Damascus and Baghdad, and who could recite the entire Quran from memory in 7 different traditional methods of recitation. My mother, Khadija bint Omar, came from a family of Islamic educators. Her father had been a professor of Islamic studies at the University of Mosul, and she herself held a degree in Quranic interpretation. She ran a small school from our home where she taught young girls aged 6 to 16 the proper recitation of the Quran, Islamic history, and the Hadith traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. Our house was always filled with the sound of children's voices practicing their Arabic pronunciation and memorizing verses that had been passed down for 14 centuries. I had 3 younger siblings. My brother Omar, 2 years younger than me, was already showing signs of following in our father's footsteps, demonstrating an exceptional memory for Islamic texts and a deep love for theological discussions. My sister Aisha was 14, quiet and studious, helping our mother with the younger students and already wearing the full hijab by her own choice. My youngest sister, Fatima, was only 11, still giggling with her friends, but already showing the serious devotion to prayer that characterized our entire family. Our family was considered well-respected in our community, not wealthy by Western standards, but comfortable by Iraqi measures. My father received a modest salary from the mosque, supplemented by donations from congregants and fees from the religious ceremonies he performed. My mother's teaching brought in additional income, and together they had managed to purchase our small but adequate home in the old city, just a 10-minute walk from the mosque where my father led prayers 5 times each day. Every morning in our household began at 4:30 a.m. with the call to Far prayer. My father would wake first, perform his ablutions, and then gently wake each of us children. By the time the muezzin's call echoed across the city, our entire family would already be standing in neat rows in our small prayer room, facing Mecca, reciting the morning prayers that Muslims around the world were offering at that same moment. After prayers, my mother would prepare a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, olives, and tea, and my father would review with us the Islamic teachings we were expected to memorize that day. My religious education began before I could even read Arabic properly. By age 4, I was sitting in the back of my father's study while he prepared his Friday sermons, absorbing the rhythms and sounds of classical Arabic. By age 6, I had memorized the opening chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, and could recite it perfectly during our family prayers. My father enrolled me in the local madrasa when I turned 7, where I joined 40 other boys in a rigorous program of Quranic memorization, Arabic grammar, Islamic history, and religious law. By age 12, I had accomplished what fewer than 1% of Muslims worldwide ever achieve. I had memorized the entire Quran, all 6,236 verses, and could recite any chapter from memory without error. This achievement, known as becoming a Hafiz, brought tremendous honor to my family and elevated my status within our community. My father wept with pride during the ceremony where I demonstrated my complete memorization before a panel of 3 senior Islamic scholars. The entire mosque congregation attended, and afterward, families from across our district came to our home to congratulate my parents and to ask for my prayers, believing that the prayers of a young Hafiz carried special blessing from Allah. But my Islamic education extended far beyond mere memorization. Under my father's guidance, I began studying the scholarly interpretations of Quranic verses developed by Islamic theologians over the centuries. I learned about the circumstances of revelation for each chapter, understanding not just what the verses said but why they had been revealed to the Prophet Muhammad and how they applied to contemporary Muslim life. I studied the hadith collections, the thousands of recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet, learning to distinguish between authentic and weak traditions according to the complex science of hadith authentication that Islamic scholars had developed. By the time I turned 16, I was already leading prayers at our mosque when my father was ill or traveling. I had begun giving short talks to younger students about Islamic history and theology. Community members would approach me with questions about Islamic law, seeking guidance on matters ranging from business transactions to family disputes. I felt the weight of spiritual responsibility settling on my shoulders, and I embraced it willingly, believing that Allah had chosen me for religious leadership just as He had chosen my father and grandfather before me. My understanding of Christianity was shaped entirely by traditional Islamic teaching. I learned that Christians were people of the book, who had originally received revelation from Allah through the Prophet Jesus. However, I was taught that over the centuries, Christians had corrupted their scriptures, introducing false doctrines like the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus that contradicted the pure monotheism that Allah had revealed. I believed that while Christians were better than pagans or atheists, they had strayed from the true path and would face judgment in the afterlife unless they accepted Islam. I viewed Jesus, whom we called Isa in Arabic, as one of the great prophets sent by Allah, a miraculous figure who had been born of the Virgin Maryam and who had performed healing miracles by Allah's permission. But I firmly believed that he was entirely human, a messenger like Moses and Muhammad, and that Christians had committed the grave sin of shirk, associating partners with Allah, by claiming that Jesus was divine. The idea that God could have a son was not just wrong in my understanding, it was blasphemous, a fundamental misunderstanding of Allah's transcendent nature. When I turned 18, I enrolled at the University of Mosul to study Islamic jurisprudence and Arabic literature. My father had dreamed of this moment since my birth, envisioning me following his path toward becoming a respected Islamic scholar and eventually an imam myself. The university's Islamic studies program was rigorous, requiring mastery of classical Arabic texts that were centuries old, deep study of the 4 major schools of Islamic law, and comprehensive understanding of Islamic philosophy and theology. During my university years, I deepened my involvement in our mosque community. I began teaching Quran memorization to boys aged 8 to 12, passing on the techniques and discipline that had been instilled in me. I helped organize Islamic youth conferences and study groups. During the holy month of Ramadan, I would lead the special night prayers called Tarawih, reciting different portions of the Quran each evening, while the congregation stood in devotion behind me. These were some of the most fulfilling moments of my young life, feeling the spiritual connection that flowed between the imam and the worshippers during those sacred hours. I had been quietly considering marriage proposals from families in our community, young women who had been raised with the same devotion to Islam that characterized my own upbringing. There was one young woman in particular, Zara, the daughter of another imam from a neighboring district, who I had met at Islamic conferences and with whom I felt a strong compatibility of values and aspirations. Our families had begun informal discussions about a potential engagement, and I found myself imagining a future where I would continue my father's legacy while building my own family according to Islamic principles. By the spring of 2022, I was in my 4th year of university, preparing for comprehensive examinations that would qualify me to begin graduate studies in Islamic jurisprudence. I had been accepted for advanced study at a prestigious Islamic university in Damascus, Syria, following the same path my father had taken decades earlier. My family was making plans for my engagement to Zara, and we were discussing the possibility of my eventually taking over some of my father's responsibilities at the mosque as he grew older. Life felt stable, purposeful, and completely ordered. I woke each morning knowing exactly who I was, what I believed, and where my life was heading. I was Adam Hamza, son of an imam, hafiz of the Quran, devoted Muslim, future Islamic scholar, and faithful servant of Allah. Nothing in my experience or imagination could have prepared me for how completely that identity was about to be shattered. The morning of June 14, 2022, began like any other morning in my life. I woke at 4:30 a.m. for far prayer, joined my family in our daily devotions, ate breakfast with them while discussing my plans for the day, and kissed my mother goodbye as I prepared to leave for the university library. I had an important research project due the following week on medieval Islamic legal interpretations, and I planned to spend the entire day studying in the quiet archives where the oldest manuscripts were kept. The library was located in the heart of the old city, about 20 minutes from our home by bicycle. As I rode through the narrow streets that morning, I noticed more military vehicles than usual, Iraqi army trucks positioned at several intersections, soldiers who looked tense and alert. There had been rumors for weeks about ISIS movements in the countryside outside Mosul, but the government had assured residents that the city was secure and well defended. I spent the morning deep in my research, surrounded by ancient texts written by Islamic scholars who had lived centuries before me, tracing the development of legal principles that still guided Muslim communities around the world. Around midday, I took a break from my studies to perform Dur prayer in the small prayer room that the library maintained for Muslim students and faculty. As I was finishing my prayers, I heard the first sounds of gunfire in the distance. Initially, I assumed it was just a routine military exercise or perhaps police dealing with some minor criminal activity. But as the shooting continued and grew closer, other students in the library began to look worried. One of the librarians came through the reading rooms telling everyone that the library was closing early as a precautionary measure. I gathered my books and notes, planning to continue my research at home. As I stepped outside the library building, I could see smoke rising from several locations across the city. The sound of automatic weapons fire was now clearly audible, coming from multiple directions. Groups of people were hurrying through the streets, some carrying hastily packed bags, others simply running. The atmosphere of normal daily life had been replaced by something I had never experienced before, a feeling of collective fear and uncertainty. I retrieved my bicycle and began pedaling home as quickly as possible, taking the most direct route through the old city. But as I turned onto the main street that led to our neighborhood, I found my way blocked by a checkpoint that had not been there that morning. Instead of Iraqi army soldiers, the checkpoint was manned by men wearing black uniforms and carrying weapons I did not recognize. They had stopped all traffic and were questioning everyone who approached. As I got closer, I could see that these were not government forces. These men had the long beards and distinctive appearance of ISIS fighters, and they were examining identification documents and questioning people about their religious affiliations and tribal connections. My heart began to race as I realized that the impossible had happened. ISIS had somehow taken control of this part of Mosul, and I was trapped. I considered turning around and trying to find another route home, but there were already fighters behind me, sealing off the street. I had no choice but to approach the checkpoint and hope that my identification as the son of a respected imam would protect me. I was a devout Muslim, after all, someone who had dedicated his entire life to Islamic study and practice. Surely these men, who claimed to be fighting for the establishment of a true Islamic state, would recognize me as an ally rather than an enemy. I was terribly, tragically wrong. When I presented my university identification card to the fighter who was processing people at the checkpoint, his expression changed immediately. University students were automatically suspect in ISIS ideology, seen as corrupted by Western education and secular thinking. When he learned that I was studying Islamic jurisprudence, he became even more hostile, accusing me of being trained in the moderate, compromised version of Islam that they considered to be apostasy. But what sealed my fate was when they searched my backpack and found my research materials. Among my books was a comparative study of different schools of Islamic legal interpretation, including some references to how Islamic law had been adapted in different historical periods and cultural contexts. To these extremists, any suggestion that Islamic law could be interpreted flexibly or adapted to different circumstances was evidence of corruption and unbelief. Within minutes, I found myself zip-tied with my hands behind my back, thrown into the back of a pickup truck with 5 other prisoners, all of us Muslims who had somehow failed to meet the impossible standards of purity that ISIS demanded. The truck began moving through the city, and I watched through the back window as my familiar neighborhood disappeared, replaced by areas I had never seen before, where black ISIS flags now flew from government buildings, and where the streets were patrolled by armed men who looked like they had stepped out of a medieval battlefield. The journey to our place of captivity took about 2 hours, during which time none of us prisoners were allowed to speak. We were driven to a compound on the outskirts of the city, a collection of concrete buildings surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire. As we were unloaded from the truck, I could see dozens of other prisoners being moved around the compound, some in orange jumpsuits, others in their regular clothes, all looking terrified and defeated. I was separated from the other prisoners who had been captured with me and placed in a small cell that measured perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet. The walls were concrete, there was no window, and the only light came from a single bulb that hung from the ceiling and remained on 24 hours a day. There was a thin mattress on the floor, a bucket in one corner that served as a toilet, and nothing else. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else that I later realized was the smell of fear itself. For the first 3 days, I was given nothing to eat except a piece of bread and a cup of water once each day. I was not allowed to leave the cell for any reason, not even to use a proper bathroom or to clean myself. The isolation was complete and devastating. I had never in my life gone more than a few hours without human contact, and suddenly I was alone in a way that felt like a form of death itself. On the 4th day, they began the interrogations. I was taken from my cell, blindfolded, and led to another room where 2 ISIS officials questioned me about my background, my family, my studies, my political opinions, and my interpretation of various Islamic teachings. They seemed particularly interested in my father's sermons and wanted to know whether he had ever criticized ISIS or expressed support for the Iraqi government. The questioning sessions lasted for hours and became increasingly aggressive as the interrogators tried to find evidence that my family and I were enemies of their cause. They accused my father of teaching a corrupted version of Islam because he had studied in Damascus, which they considered to be under the influence of the Syrian government. They accused me of being indoctrinated with Western ideas because I attended university. They accused my entire family of being collaborators with the Iraqi government because my father received a salary from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. No matter how I answered their questions, no matter how much I emphasized my own devotion to Islam and my family's reputation for piety, they remained convinced that we were dangerous to their movement. After several days of interrogation, they informed me that I had been classified as a suspected enemy of the Islamic State and that I would remain in captivity indefinitely while they decided my ultimate fate. The weeks that followed were the darkest period of my entire life. I was moved to a larger cell that I shared with 12 other prisoners, including 3 Christians, 2 Yazidis, 1 Shia Muslim, and 6 Sunni Muslims like myself who had been deemed insufficiently loyal to ISIS ideology. The overcrowding was unbearable, the hygiene conditions were terrible, and the psychological pressure was constant. Our daily routine was designed to break our spirits and our sense of human dignity. We were woken at 4 a.m. and forced to clean the prison facilities, scrubbing floors and walls with inadequate supplies while guards verbally abused us. We were given one small meal per day, usually consisting of rice, bread, and sometimes a small piece of meat that was often spoiled. We were forced to listen to hours of ISIS propaganda broadcasts, recordings of sermons that glorified violence and condemned everyone who opposed their interpretation of Islam. The worst part was watching what happened to other prisoners who were selected for special treatment. Some were taken away for additional interrogation and returned bearing signs of physical abuse. Others were taken away and never returned at all. We could sometimes hear screaming from other parts of the compound, and we all knew that some of our fellow prisoners were being tortured or executed, though we were never told exactly what was happening to them. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself questioning everything I had ever believed about God, about justice, about the meaning of faith itself. I had been raised to believe that Allah was merciful and compassionate, that He protected the innocent and punished the wicked. But here I was, a devout Muslim who had never harmed anyone, suffering alongside Christians and Yazidis and other Muslims, all of us being brutalized by men who claimed to be serving Allah's will. I began to wonder whether Allah had abandoned me, whether my prayers were reaching Him, whether He even existed at all. The faith that had been the foundation of my entire life began to crumble under the weight of suffering that seemed meaningless and endless. I prayed the traditional Islamic prayers, but the words felt empty, mechanical, disconnected from any divine presence or power. It was during this period of spiritual crisis that I first began to pay attention to the Christian prisoners in my cell. There were 3 of them, 2 middle-aged men named Yusuf and Marwan, and 1 young woman named Maryam who was about my age. They had been captured when ISIS overran their village, and they had been imprisoned for months before I arrived. What struck me about these Christians was not their suffering, which was identical to ours, but their response to their suffering. Despite everything they had endured, despite the uncertainty about their fate, despite being surrounded by people who considered them to be infidels deserving of death, they maintained a sense of peace and hope that I could not understand. Every morning, before the guards came to wake us, I would see them quietly praying together, not with the formal movements and Arabic recitations of Islamic prayer, but with simple words spoken in their own language, words that seemed to come from their hearts rather than from memorized texts. They would pray for their families, for their captors, for their fellow prisoners, and for strength to endure whatever lay ahead. In the evenings, when we were locked in our cell for the night, they would quietly sing songs together, Christian hymns that spoke of God's love and protection even in the midst of suffering. The melodies were beautiful, and the words, even though I didn't understand all of them, carried a sense of hope that was completely foreign to my experience. Most remarkably, they treated everyone in the cell with kindness and respect, sharing what little food they had, helping to care for prisoners who became sick, offering comfort to those who were particularly distressed. They even showed compassion toward our guards, responding to abuse and insults with patience rather than anger. I found myself drawn to conversations with these Christians, initially out of curiosity about their beliefs, but gradually out of a deeper hunger for the peace that they seemed to possess. Yusuf, the older of the 2 men, had been a pastor in his village, and he was able to answer my questions about Christian theology with knowledge and depth that surprised me. When I asked him how he could maintain his faith in a God who allowed such suffering, he told me about Jesus Christ, not as the prophet that I had learned about in Islam, but as the Son of God who had experienced human suffering himself. He explained that Jesus had been tortured and executed by religious authorities who considered him a blasphemer, and that through his death and resurrection, he had made it possible for all people to be reconciled with God. These conversations took place in whispers, usually late at night when the guards were less likely to be paying attention. If we had been caught discussing Christianity, the consequences would have been severe, possibly fatal. But I found myself compelled to learn more about a faith that could sustain people through such extreme suffering. One night, about 4 months into my captivity, Miriam quietly shared with me a small portion of the New Testament that she had somehow managed to keep hidden from our captors. The pages were worn and stained, and some of the text was illegible. But she showed me passages from the Gospel of Matthew that described Jesus' teaching about love for enemies and forgiveness for those who persecute you. As I read these words, written in Arabic translation, I felt something stirring in my heart that I had never experienced before. The idea that God could love his enemies, that divine mercy could extend even to those who rejected him, was revolutionary to my understanding. In Islam, I had learned that Allah was merciful to those who submitted to him, but the concept of unconditional love for all humanity, including those who opposed God, was completely new to me. That night, for the first time in my life, I found myself praying not to Allah, but to Jesus. I didn't have the words for a proper prayer, and I wasn't even sure what I believed about who Jesus was, but I found myself asking him to help me understand the truth about God and about myself. I asked him to show me how to find peace in the midst of suffering, how to maintain hope when everything seemed hopeless. What happened next I can only describe as a supernatural encounter that changed the entire direction of my life. As I was praying silently in the darkness of our cell, while my fellow prisoners slept around me, I became aware of a presence in the room that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. There was no visible appearance, no audible voice, but there was an overwhelming sense of love and acceptance that filled my entire being. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that Jesus Christ was present with me in that prison cell. I knew that he was not merely a prophet, as I had been taught, but the Son of God, as the Christians believed. I knew that he loved me personally and individually, despite my lifelong rejection of him. I knew that he had the power to save me, not just from my physical captivity, but from the spiritual bondage that had kept me separated from God's true nature. I cannot explain how I knew these things, any more than I can explain how the sun rises each morning or how my heart beats without my conscious control. It was knowledge that came from beyond my rational mind, a revelation that penetrated directly into my soul. For the first time in months, I felt peace. For the first time in my life, I felt truly loved by God. From that night forward, my entire perspective on my situation began to change. I was still a prisoner, still facing an uncertain future, still surrounded by danger and suffering. But I was no longer alone, and I was no longer afraid. I began to pray regularly to Jesus, asking him to guide me and to help me understand more about his nature and his purposes. The Christian prisoners noticed the change in me immediately. They saw that I had begun to experience the same peace that sustained them, and they welcomed me into their small fellowship with joy and gratitude. They began to teach me more about Christian beliefs, sharing stories from the Bible, explaining the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection, helping me to understand concepts like salvation by grace and eternal life through faith. Over the following weeks, I came to understand that becoming a Christian was not simply a matter of changing my theological opinions or adopting different religious practices. It was a fundamental transformation of my relationship with God, a movement from trying to earn divine approval through my own efforts to accepting divine love as a free gift. I learned that Jesus had died to pay the penalty for human sin, including my own, and that through faith in him, I could be forgiven and reconciled with God. This understanding led me to a moment of formal conversion that took place about 6 months into my captivity. During one of our quiet evening discussions, I told Yusuf that I wanted to accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, that I believed he was the Son of God who had died for my sins and risen from the dead. Yusuf led me in a simple prayer of faith, and in that moment, I became a Christian. The transformation was immediate and profound. I felt as though a weight that I had carried my entire life had been lifted from my shoulders. The guilt and fear that had characterized my relationship with God under Islam were replaced by a sense of acceptance and belonging that I had never known was possible. I understood for the first time what it meant to be called a child of God rather than merely a servant. But my conversion also brought new dangers. I had to be extremely careful not to let the guards discover my change of faith, since conversion from Islam to Christianity was considered one of the most serious crimes in ISIS ideology, punishable by immediate execution. I continued to participate in the Islamic prayers that all prisoners were forced to perform, but in my heart, I was praying to Jesus. The Christian prisoners helped me to understand how to maintain my faith in secret, how to find opportunities for genuine prayer and Bible study, how to grow spiritually even in the midst of such hostile circumstances. They taught me Christian hymns that I could sing silently to myself, Christian prayers that I could offer in my heart, and Christian truths that I could meditate on during the long hours of forced labor and propaganda sessions. As my understanding of Christianity deepened, I began to see my captivity in a completely different light. Rather than a meaningless tragedy, I began to understand it as part of God's plan to bring me to faith in Jesus Christ. I realized that without this extreme suffering, I might never have been open to questioning my Islamic beliefs or considering the claims of Christianity. God had used even the evil actions of my captors to accomplish His purposes in my life. This perspective helped me to develop genuine forgiveness for my captors, something that would have been impossible under my previous Islamic worldview. Jesus' teaching about loving our enemies and praying for those who persecute us became real and practical in my daily experience. I began to pray for the guards who abused us, asking God to reveal Himself to them as He had revealed Himself to me. After 8 months in captivity, an event occurred that I can only describe as miraculous. A coalition of Iraqi government forces and international troops launched an operation to liberate our prison compound. The attack came without warning in the early morning hours, and within a few hours our captors had either fled or been captured themselves. As the prison doors were opened and we were led to safety, I knew that this was not merely a military victory, but an answer to months of prayer. God had not only saved my soul through Jesus Christ, but He had also arranged for my physical liberation at exactly the right time. I was free to begin a new life as both a liberated prisoner and a newborn Christian. The rescue operation transported all of the freed prisoners to a refugee camp near Baghdad, where we received medical treatment, counseling, and assistance with contacting our families. It was here that I faced one of the most difficult decisions of my life. I knew that I could not return to my family as the same person who had left them 8 months earlier. I was no longer the devout Muslim son they had raised, but a Christian convert whose new faith would be seen as betrayal and apostasy. After much prayer and consultation with Christian relief workers at the camp, I made the painful decision to contact my family and tell them the truth about my conversion. The phone call to my father was one of the most heartbreaking experiences of my life. When I explained that I had become a Christian, there was a long silence, followed by weeping, followed by anger that gradually turned to cold rejection. My father told me that as far as our family was concerned, I had died in captivity. The son they had loved and raised no longer existed. If I attempted to return home, I would not be welcome, and my presence would bring shame and danger to the entire family. My mother, my siblings, my former fiancé, everyone I had ever cared about, would be instructed to treat me as though I were dead. This rejection was devastating, but it was not entirely unexpected. I had known that following Jesus Christ would require sacrificing my old life, my family relationships, my community standing, my planned future. What I had not fully understood was how complete that sacrifice would be, or how painful the process of letting go would prove to be. The refugee camp became my home for the next 6 months while I applied for asylum in various countries that were accepting Iraqi Christians who had fled persecution. During this time, I was able to study the Bible systematically for the first time, to participate openly in Christian worship services, and to receive formal Christian education from missionaries and pastors who were working with refugees. This period of intensive Christian discipleship was crucial for establishing the foundations of my new faith and preparing me for the challenges of starting over in a completely new country and culture. I learned not only about Christian doctrine and practice, but about how to live as a Christian in the midst of a hostile world, how to maintain faith during times of transition and uncertainty, and how to find purpose and meaning in a life that had been completely disrupted. My asylum application was eventually approved by Canada, and in March 2023, I flew to Toronto to begin my new life as a Christian immigrant. The transition was overwhelming in every possible way. I had to learn English, find employment, adapt to a culture that was completely foreign to my experience, and build relationships with people who had no understanding of what I had been through. But the most challenging aspect of starting over was learning how to live as a Christian in a free society. In the refugee camp, My faith had been sustained by the intensity of shared suffering and the close community of fellow believers who had endured similar experiences. In Canada, I had to discover how to maintain my relationship with Jesus Christ in the midst of ordinary daily life, how to find Christian fellowship among people who had never experienced persecution, and how to share my testimony with those who could barely imagine what I had been through. I was blessed to find a church community that welcomed me with open arms and provided both practical support and spiritual encouragement as I established my new life. The pastor, a man named David Thompson, became a mentor and friend who helped me navigate the challenges of cultural adaptation while maintaining my Christian identity. The congregation provided financial assistance, language tutoring, job training, and most importantly, the love and acceptance that helped to heal the wounds left by my family's rejection. Finding employment was difficult initially because my Iraqi university credentials were not recognized in Canada, and my English was still limited. I worked for several months in manual labor jobs while taking English classes and studying to pass equivalency exams that would allow me to continue my education. Eventually, I was able to enroll in a Christian college where I am currently studying theology and preparing for pastoral ministry. My goal is to return to the Middle East as a missionary, not to Iraq where my life would be in danger, but to other countries where I can work with Arab Christians and Muslim refugees who are seeking truth. I want to share the gospel with people who have backgrounds similar to my own, who understand the cost of leaving Islam for Christianity, who need to hear that Jesus Christ offers hope even in the darkest circumstances. My hope is that this testimony will encourage Christians in the West to appreciate the freedom they have to worship openly, and that it will challenge Muslims who are seeking truth to consider the claims of Jesus Christ seriously. The scars from my captivity have healed, but the memories remain vivid. I still have nightmares sometimes about my time in prison, and I still struggle with the grief of losing my family and my homeland. But these sufferings pale in comparison to the joy of knowing Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and the peace that comes from understanding that my life has eternal meaning and purpose. Looking back on my journey, I can see how God orchestrated every detail to bring about my salvation. My Islamic education gave me a deep appreciation for scripture and theology that has served me well in my Christian studies. My suffering in captivity prepared my heart to receive the gospel and gave me a testimony that opens doors for ministry among persecuted Christians. My experience as a refugee has equipped me to minister to others who have lost everything for the sake of their faith. Most importantly, my conversion has taught me that God's love truly knows no boundaries. He reached into an ISIS prison cell to save a young Muslim who had never seriously considered Christianity. He used the very people I had been taught to consider enemies to introduce me to his Son. He transformed my greatest tragedy into my greatest blessing. If God can save someone like me, He can save anyone. If God can work even through the evil of ISIS captivity to accomplish His purposes, He can work through any circumstances to draw people to Himself. If God can give peace and hope to a prisoner facing possible execution, He can give peace and hope to anyone who calls upon the name of Jesus Christ. This is why I tell my story, not to glorify the suffering I endured, but to glorify the God who redeemed that suffering for His purposes. This is why I have given up everything that